We approached the coffin and realized that the body was no longer there. That was impossible. There was no one at the funeral home who could have moved it. A scream in the empty adjoining room made us run over there. Someone had seen something terrifying. Something they could never forget. Welcome to one of the scariest episodes I remember from Relatos de la Noche. And that's my opinion. And I'm going to tell you why. Because it's about Easter Sunday. Because there are two stories that happen specifically on this date. But also because they all talk about the dead, about bodies, about apparitions, about corpses that seem like they don't want to leave and keep manifesting themselves in one way or another. I won't go further into today's stories. Discover them for yourselves. And of course, let us know your opinion. You are listening to Relatos de la Noche. Good evening, Uriel. Good evening, everyone. This happened in my family a few years ago, during a Holy Week that none of us has been able to forget. The main character in all of this was my uncle Rodolfo, although everyone in the family simply knew him as Uncle Rodo. He was my mom's youngest sibling. He never got married. He never had children, and for many years he practically disappeared from our lives. As a child, he was rarely mentioned at home, and we knew he existed, but not much more. Sometimes my mom mentioned him as if he was some distant cousin, saying things like he had gone to work in another city or that he was traveling. Nothing very clear. Years went by like that. My grandparents were still alive at that time and they never seemed worried about him. They probably thought he'd return eventually. But he didn't come back. Not while they were still around, at least. For a long time we didn't know anything. Until one day, many years later, he showed up again. I remember well the first time I saw him when he came back. I was already a teenager. He showed up at a family gathering without warning, as if he had never left. He greeted everyone very calmly, hugged his siblings, and sat down to chat, as if only a few weeks had passed, but everyone said they knew. He looked very different. They couldn't explain exactly what it was. He didn't seem sick or anything like that. But there was something in the way he spoke, in the way he looked, that made you feel he wasn't the same person who had left so many years ago. Some of my uncles whispered that while he was away, he got involved in strange things. Things like religion, rituals, santeria, or something like that. No one knew exactly what. The truth is that in my family, no one wanted to talk much about it. Also, by that time, my grandparents had already passed away, so they never got to see how he had changed when he came back. Uncle Rodo settled in a small house he had on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't a big house. Actually, it was something quite simple, to be honest. A bit removed from the rest of the neighborhood. He sometimes attended family gatherings. Sometimes he disappeared for weeks. And that's how a few months went by. Until the thing that set everything off happened. One day my mom started to worry because no one had heard anything from him in several days. He ignored calls and wouldn't open the door when people checked on him. In the end, one of my uncles went to his house to see if everything was okay, and that's where they found him. He was dead. They found him sitting in a chair inside the house. Oddly, no one knew how long he had been there. It could have been hours or days, but there was something very strange. It didn't smell. Anyone who has ever been near a body knows that after a certain amount of time, the smell appears and it's impossible to ignore. But in Uncle Rodon's house, there was nothing, not even the slightest smell. Ultimately, it was treated as a natural death. The doctor who examined the body said it was probably something to do with the heart, There was no investigation or anything like that. So the family simply decided to hold a wake for him. The funeral home prepared everything for Holy Saturday, in a small room where many families in the city held wakes for their dead. Everything started out pretty normal, honestly. His brothers were there. Some cousins who knew him when he was young. Those who came to offer condolences. The coffin was open as is usually done, and Uncle Rodo looked peaceful, almost as if he were asleep. The hours went by and people came and went. Some prayed. Others spoke in low voices, and others simply sat in silence. There was always a very strong tradition in the family. My grandmother used to say the dead had to be watched all night, that the body should never be left alone before the burial. She often repeated it, and everyone respected it. That's why no one planned to leave. The idea was to stay until morning. But around midnight, something happened. A funeral home worker entered and approached my mom and uncles. He told them there was a problem with the service, and that they needed everyone to leave the room for a moment while they cleared something up with the manager. That really surprised everyone. When they arranged the wake, they had specifically paid to stay there all night. There were some arguments, but in the end, after insisting a little, the worker said it would only be for a moment. Once he confirmed with his boss, they could return inside. Everyone went out into the hallway and then out to the street. No one was happy with the situation. My mom said my grandma wouldn't have liked it if they left Uncle Rodo alone even for a few minutes. And some time went by, 10 minutes, maybe 15. But it wasn't much when the same worker returned and said everything was cleared up, that they could come back in. Then they all went back into the room again. Someone said something there that others initially didn't understand. Where is he? At first, they didn't know what he was referring to. But when they looked to the front of the room, they saw it. The coffin was open, but it was also empty. Uncle Rodo's body was not there. There were a few seconds of complete silence, and then chaos began. Everyone started looking around, wondering if someone from the funeral home had moved the body for some reason. They searched the hallways, bathrooms, and other rooms, but they couldn't find it. The funeral home worker swore that no one had entered or left while the family was outside, that he himself had been with them at the door. The situation started to get very tense, until one of my uncles said he was going to check the next room, which had been empty all night. It was a small room they used to store chairs or flowers when there weren't any wakes. The door was ajar. There was no light inside. My uncle pushed the door open and turned on the light switch. Then he saw him. Rodo was there, sitting on one of the wooden benches, looking straight ahead, toward the small altar at the back of the room. He fell silent. The others went to see, and no one spoke for several seconds. They were simply watching. The funeral home worker was the first to react. He made the sign of the cross. He said he had nothing to do with that, and that he wasn't going to stay there a minute longer. He left the room. He left the funeral home and didn't return. Those brothers were the ones who came over. They lifted the body together and took it back to the coffin. They didn't let anyone else touch him. No one understood what had happened. No one wanted to discuss it at that moment. They simply arranged the body again. They closed the coffin a little and sat there in silence until one of my cousins checked the wall clock. It showed a few minutes past 12, and someone said in a low voice something that I still remember perfectly, that it was already Easter Sunday. My name is Margarita. I'm 28 years old and I've been listening to you since the pandemic. It's amazing how many years have passed. That's half the lifespan of Relatos de la Noche. And it was my sister, who's also a fan of the podcast, who convinced me to send in this story. For a long time, we thought that what happened that day was just our imagination as little girls. But recently we talked about it again, and we both remember exactly the same thing. This happened when we were kids. At that time, our cousin Alex passed away. He was a few years older than us. We weren't very close to him because our families didn't spend much time together, but even so, his death was a very hard blow for everyone. Losing a child in the family is something that completely changes the atmosphere of any home. We were sad, of course, but more than anything I remember the feeling of seeing the adults' pain. Seeing our parents, our uncles, and my grandparents cry. That was what impressed us the most. The burial was the day after we got that news. I remember the cemetery being crowded. A lot of people had come to say goodbye to Alex and to support the family. The adults were focused on the coffin, on the priest, on the prayers. And my sister and I, who were quite young at the time, ended up moving away a little. We weren't exactly playing, but we were walking among the graves, looking around. At that age, you don't really understand what's going on. Sometimes the way to cope is to distract yourself a little. And it was at that moment that I saw the girl. She was standing between two small graves looking at me. She seemed to be my age, maybe 1 or 2 years older. She had dark hair and was standing still, watching me with curiosity, as if she wanted to tell me something but didn't dare. Then she raised a hand and gestured to me. The typical sign kids make when they want someone to come play. I looked at her for a few seconds. I didn't think anything was strange. There were a lot of relatives at the cemetery that day, and I assumed she was just a girl who was there with her family too. So I walked toward her. My sister was a bit behind me. The girl turned around and started walking among the graves. I followed her. She wasn't running or anything. She just walked among the tombstones, looking back from time to time to make sure I was still there. We ended up reaching a corner of the cemetery where I saw a large tomb, one of those with angel sculptures on top. It was an old tomb, quite large, that stood out from the rest. The girl looked at me again and made another gesture. This time, it was as if she wanted me to hide there with her. She crouched down a little and pointed to the back of the tomb, as if inviting me to go behind it. I went around the tomb, but when I got to the other side, the girl was already gone. I looked to both sides, thinking she had crouched down or was hiding somewhere among the nearby tombs, but I didn't see anyone. I was about to keep walking to look for her when someone grabbed my arm. It was my sister. She told me we should go to our parents, that we shouldn't go so far away. I told her I was playing with a girl who was around there, but my sister insisted that we go back. So we went back to where the family was. When we got there, I told my mom that there was a girl playing near a big grave with angels. My mom, who at that moment was very sensitive because of what was happening, got worried, thinking that maybe we had gone too far. So she decided to come with us to see where we had been. We walked again to that corner of the cemetery. When we got behind the big grave, my mom stopped. There was a mound of fresh earth covered with flowers. It was a recent grave. You could tell the burial had taken place that very day or maybe the day before. It still didn't have a headstone. There was only a small wooden marker stuck in the ground. My mom walked over to read it. I remember her expression changed when I saw the name. It was the name of a girl, and underneath was the age. The same age I was at that time. My mom stared at the plaque for a few seconds and then told us that she probably lived. I had seen that grave before and my imagination had done the rest. After all, we were in a cemetery as kids, and that day there were a lot of mixed emotions. So we just went back to the family. I also ended up thinking that I had probably imagined it, that I had seen the girl's grave and my mind had imagined the rest. But when we were on our way back home in the car, my sister told me something that I still remember perfectly. She asked me, "Did the girl call you to play?" I told her yes. Then my sister stayed quiet for a moment and said something that gave me goosebumps. She told me she hadn't imagined her, that she had seen her too, and that's why she followed me. But she didn't call me because she was playing. She called me because the girl was pointing at the grave, as if she wanted me to go with her. And that's when she was playing, and she saw people nearby. She realized something she hadn't noticed at that moment. The girl's skin was gray, as if she were dead. Thank you. Thank you for continuing to listen to tonight's stories. I remind you that you still have the opportunity to buy the book at the link in the description. And there's a very important announcement coming up in just a couple of weeks. So take advantage, I know what I'm telling you. If you already have it, tag us if you post your book on social media and let us know what you think about these stories. We continue with more stories tonight. Hello, Relatos de la Noche community, greetings. I'm Sebastián and I'm writing to you from the province of Entre Rios in Argentina. I've been listening to you for several years, and many times I thought about sending this story, but I always hesitated, because not even in my own family can we agree on what happened. This happened many years ago in the town where I grew up. It's a pretty small place. That year during the same week, two men who were exactly the same died. They had the same first and last name. Both were named Carlos Romero. One was an older man, already quite ill, who had been in poor health for months. And the other was quite young, a man who worked in the fields and who died quite suddenly. Having the same name had already caused some confusion from the beginning, because they were also treated at the same hospital. They even made a couple of mistakes when talking to the families. But nobody imagined that the problem was going to go much further. Both wakes were organized almost at the same time, at the same funeral home in the town. It wasn't a big place. It had 2 rooms for wakes and a small room where they prepared the bodies. The families were different, but a lot of people from the town ended up going to both wakes because they knew both of them. The first one to be buried was Mr. Mayer. The burial was on a Saturday afternoon. Everything went normally. The procession left from the funeral home to the town cemetery. The priest said a few words and finally they lowered the coffin. The other Carlos Romero was going to be buried the next day on Resurrection Sunday. The family gathered early at the funeral home to close the coffin before taking it to the cemetery. That's when the problem started. One of the deceased sons approached to see him one last time before closing the lid. He stood there staring in silence until he said something that left everyone what was happening. He said that was not his father. Some believed the funeral home had mixed up the coffins in their shock. Losing a loved one is always hard. That's when the insistence started. He said that man was not his father, that he looked like him, but he was not the family member. He approached, and then another one came closer. Gradually, everyone realized the same thing. That body didn't belong to either of the 2 men who had died that week. The funeral home staff started to check the records. At first, they thought maybe they had mixed up the bodies during preparation, so they went to the cemetery to check the burial from the previous day, but when they opened the burial record, everything seemed correct. The coffin that had been buried on Saturday did in fact belong to the first Carlos Romero. That meant the body in the wake room was neither of them, and no one at the funeral home could explain where it came from. For hours, They tried to find an answer. They checked all the paperwork, called the hospital, and even checked the small room where they kept the bodies before preparing them. But there was no mistake that could explain the situation. That corpse simply didn't belong to anyone. The story turned into chaos in the village that Sunday. The funeral home paused the burial as they tried to determine what was happening. In the end, after many phone calls and a lot of arguments, they managed to find the correct body of the second Carlos Romero at the hospital, where apparently it had been left due to a mistake during the transfers. But that only solved half of the problem, because the body that had appeared in the coffin still had no explanation. No one knew who he was. He didn't match any recent deaths at the hospital. There were no reports of missing persons during those days. He was simply a man who had appeared at the funeral home, inside a coffin prepared for someone else. The strangest thing is that as far as I know, they never managed to identify him. For months, people talked about it all over town. Many said it had been a huge administrative mistake. Others claimed that someone had brought the body by mistake from somewhere else. But there was no clear explanation. The news didn't even leave the town, although if it had happened these days, I imagine it would have even gone viral. Even today, at least in my family, we still talk about that Easter Sunday. I know we're not the only ones in town. We talk about those days. About that day. The day when two men with the same name died in the same week. And at the wake, a third one showed up, and nobody ever knew where he came from. Good evening, everyone. I'm Arturo, writing from a small town in the Bajío region. I won't say which one, since many people here still knew the person I'll mention. All I can say is that last year it was a town that was mentioned in the national news, but for another reason. People in town always said there was a witch, but not like the ones from old stories told to scare children, but a real witch. Or at least that's what people kept saying every time something strange happened. Or when someone disappeared. Or when someone died for no reason. For many years, everyone thought that witch was Doña Jacinta. She lived alone in an old house on the corner of a quiet street. The house was always neglected. The paint was peeling. The gate was rusty. The garden was overgrown with weeds. She had a dog that lived off what the neighbors gave him, although he always came back to sleep there. No one saw her or saw her fix anything. As a child, I remember that when we walked by there with other friends, we would walk faster. Not because we had seen anything, but because that's what our parents had taught us. That we shouldn't go near that house. That Doña Jacinta shouldn't see us. There were many stories about her. She talked to herself in the courtyard at night. Sometimes her house had lights on at odd hours. That she had cats that appeared and disappeared. That there was a goat that walked on two legs in her yard. But to be honest, nothing was ever really clear. They were more like stories passed from person to person. That's how the years passed too. Until one day, they simply said that Doña Jacinta had died. They found her in her house. No one knows exactly how long she had been like that. A neighbor noticed he hadn't seen her in days and decided to check in. The wake was held at her home. That's when things got strange, because practically no one showed up. People in town talked a lot about her, but when it was time to say goodbye, no one wanted to come near. Ultimately, just two elderly church ladies agreed to stay and keep vigil over her. One of them knew my mom and asked her to join them. She said she didn't want to stay all night in that house alone with the body. My mom agreed, and since I was a child and had no one to stay with me, I went too. I clearly remember what the house looked like inside. Dark, with old furniture, and a strange smell I can't really describe. They put the coffin in the middle of the room. The three ladies sat nearby, sometimes praying or speaking in low voices. I sat on a chair to the side and soon began to fall asleep. That's when I heard the first sound.
And I fell asleep.
Three small knocks. The ladies got up immediately, thinking that someone had arrived. They went to open the door, but there was no one outside. They sat down again, saying that maybe it had been the wind or some noise from the wood in the house. Some more time passed. I was already half asleep when the three knocks were heard again. This time the ladies remained silent. None of them got up. They kept looking at the door, waiting for someone to knock again. But nothing else was heard. Then I said something I'll never forget because it was unplanned. I told them the sound wasn't from the door. It came from the door, the coffin. The three of them looked at me. No one said anything. I remember one lady making the sign of the cross. After that, they kept praying. Almost an hour passed in complete silence until it was heard again. The same three knocks. We all knew where they came from this time. No one got up. No one came closer. The three ladies began to pray out loud, and they kept praying like that for hours, until dawn started to break. When morning came, they closed the coffin and left. As far as I know, none of them went to the burial. At least my mom didn't. But something even stranger happened that day. Because that morning, when the people from the town started going out into the street, everyone saw the same thing. A bunch of crows, dozens of them. They were perched on the trees and on the roof of the house on the other corner of the street. Doña Marcela's house. A very well-known lady in the town, very respected, very Catholic. One of those who were always in the church, one of those who prayed the rosary every day. People started talking about it, at first in a low voice, then more and more openly. Because for years they had pointed to the wrong house. And many started to say the same thing. That maybe Doña Jacinta hadn't been the witch of the town. That maybe the real witch had lived all that time on the other corner of the street.